So welcome to the last session of this year for Lifelight, session 9. As we mentioned in our opening, this is, I don't know if you've, I guess I could ask the question, how many of you have actually read the book of Philemon before this assignment? It's in the New Testament. We usually read through the New Testament a lot more than we do the Old Testament, but Philemon just kind of, if you're not careful, you just skip right on over it. I know in your study guides, as you were looking through some of the questions, the idea that even though it's a letter of Paul, there's not any mention of the gospel per se, or any specific, as he would with his other letters. And there's somewhat of intentionality there. I think one of your questions was the idea that Paul was very familiar with Philemon. There was no need for him to make an introduction. This was a personal letter, unlike his letter to the churches. So what I'm going to do is just kind of go over initially just some of the kind of Paul's situation in life, why he is sending this letter to his friend Philemon, and then we'll watch that just brief video from the Bible Project guys. Once again, they do a pretty good job of summary, a lot better than I could probably do because I can't draw like that. And then just a quick couple notes afterwards, then we'll conclude today. So when we think about it in terms of the date of Paul's letter to Philemon, it was during his first imprisonment. We looked at this when we were going through 1st and 2nd Timothy, but it was during his first imprisonment in Rome, and this was the house arrest imprisonment. So he's able to write freely, and people are coming and going. In fact, there's quite a few of his companions, his travel buddies, that are stopping by from time to time to visit with him while he's in this imprisonment, this house arrest. So during his house arrest, he makes use of his time. He doesn't sit around and feel sorry for himself. He's looking for ways to continue to further the gospel and to strengthen the churches. And so he writes these 4 letters while he's in this house arrest. We looked at, he wrote Timothy and Titus, 1 Timothy and Titus, after his house arrest. When he was set free, he wrote those 2 letters. And then 2 Timothy he wrote during his last arrest, which was in the dungeon. Okay, so these are during his house arrest, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. These 2 churches, the Church of Ephesus and the Church of Philippi, Paul actually established in one of his missionary journeys, the second missionary journey. These are 2 that he travels through the region, gathers together Jewish people who are, or Gentiles, I should say, and then builds the church there in these 2 major cities. This third one, Colossae, church in Colossae, or Colossians, was established by a man named Epaphras, who was a companion of Paul's, but it's actually Epaphras who establishes this church. Paul doesn't stop and set up a congregation there in the city of Colossae. Epaphras does that. And so in our letter here of Philemon, we actually say, while Paul's under this house arrest imprisonment, Epaphras is actually with him. He's now in Rome with Paul. He's one of those visitors spending some time with Paul in Rome. But we also know that Epaphras is really good friends with Philemon. You'll see this in the video in just a few minutes, but it seems pretty clear that Philemon and Epaphras served together in the church in the Colossians, in the church of Colossae. They served together there. So Epaphras and Philemon, so kind of connecting some dots here. Epaphras is in Rome with Paul. Philemon is in Colossae. We know that Philemon was converted by Paul. He's a friend, a co-worker of the Apostle Paul. Member of the church in Colossae. His wife is probably, this is mentioned in Philemon, his wife is Apphia, that is how you would say her name. And his son is Archippus. And some speculate that Archippus is actually the pastor of the church of Colossae, the Colossians, if you can say it that way. So there's a connection here between Paul and Philemon, Epaphras and Philemon in this, and you'll see this kind of in a letter here. And there's someone else is with Paul in Rome. Someone else. There's Luke, Timothy, and all this. But there's one name that's important to remember is also with Paul while he's under arrest in Rome, and that person is Onesimus. You should know that name, obviously, having read this book. And so while Paul is writing these letters of encouragement to Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, he's writing these letters, he's got a co-worker with him. He's named Onesimus. But Onesimus has a history. And what is the history? He's a former slave. He's an escaped slave. He's not a former slave in that Philemon gave him his walking papers, you're free to go. He's an escaped slave. So here's this escaped slave and Onesimus, who's a companion with Paul. And here comes Epaphras, who's a friend of Philemon's. And you have this kind of, it's kind of probably an awkward moment, I would think. When Paul's trying to figure out, what do I do here? I'm friends with Philemon. I'm friends with Onesimus, co-workers with both, and Epaphras is a friend of Philemon, and there's a kind of, I don't use the expression, they probably didn't use it back then, but there's an elephant in the room here. And the elephant is this: Onesimus is an escaped slave. And we can't just ignore it. We're gonna have to figure out what to do with this. And so that's why he writes this letter to Philemon. Probably, maybe encouraged by Epaphras to do this or whatever, but... So Paul sends the letters of Ephesians, Colossians, and Philemon with one of his co-workers, Titus. You see him quite a bit, actually. He's kind of like the, he's either UPS or Brown. I don't know which one he is, but he's delivering a lot of Paul's letters. He delivers his mail. So those letters of Ephesians, Colossians, he sends with Titus, and the letter of Philemon, actually, he sends to Philemon with who? Onesimus. There's an interesting little thing. Here's this, you wonder if Onesimus, it's just a little scroll. I mean, it's probably really small, because it's just, you wonder if Onesimus, as he's walking along, going, I wonder what Paul says. Hold up the light, you know, because I mean, this is pretty serious business. He's going back to his owner, if you will, his master, with this letter from Paul. And I'm sure Paul probably talked it over with Onesimus and said, "You've got to go back. You can't keep running. We got to make this work. There has to be reconciliation." So it'd be interesting, though, that it's almost like Titus is. I'm going to say it this way. It's probably too strong, but it's almost like Onesimus's go-between. You know, if Onesimus is recognized as a runaway slave by anybody in Colossae. He could have been arrested, he could have been, you know, whatever. And so Titus kind of comes with the authority of the Apostle Paul, kind of to make sure that Onesimus gets to Philemon safely. All right, so let's watch this video. Like I said, they do a really good job of giving a bit better of a summary here. They're going to use a fancy word that we've used before in this class, one you should know by heart now, koinonia. That plays a role into this as well.
Paul's letter to Philemon. It was written during one of Paul's many imprisonments, and it's actually his shortest letter in the New Testament. But don't let its size trick you. It's actually one of the most explosive things that Paul ever wrote. Here's the backstory that we can piece together from details within the letter. Philemon was a well-to-do Roman citizen from Colossae, who likely met Paul during his mission in Ephesus, and he became a follower of Jesus. Then later, when Paul's co-worker Epaphras started a Jesus community in Colossae, Philemon became a leader of a church that met in his house. Now, Philemon, like all household patriarchs in the Roman world, owned slaves, one of whom was named Onesimus. And at some point, these two had a serious conflict. Onesimus wronged Philemon in some way. Maybe it was theft, or maybe he cheated him, we don't exactly know. But afterwards, Onesimus ran away. Eventually, Onesimus came to Paul in prison, likely to appeal for help. And in the process, he became a follower of Jesus, and then a beloved assistant of Paul. And so Paul finds himself in a very difficult and delicate situation as he writes this letter. He's going to ask Philemon not just to forgive Onesimus and receive him back, but to embrace him as a brother in the Messiah and no longer as a slave. Here's how he does it. Paul opens with a prayer, first praising Philemon and thanking God for the love and faithfulness he's shown to Jesus, to his people. And he then paves the way for his request with this line: I pray that the partnership that springs from your faith may effectively lead you to recognize all the good things that work in us, leading us into the Messiah. Now, a key word here is partnership, or in Greek, koinonia. It means sharing or mutual participation. It's when two or more people receive something together and share in it, becoming partners. Paul's saying that faithfulness to Jesus means recognizing that all of his followers are equal partners who share together in the gift of God's love and grace. And for Paul, this experience of koinonia among Jesus' followers, it's not just an idea that you think about, it's something that you do in your relationships. Which moves Paul on to his request. He finally brings up Onesimus. He says that he's become Paul's child in prison, meaning that Paul led Onesimus to dedicate his life and allegiance to Jesus, and so Paul and Onesimus are now family members in the Messiah. He's been serving Paul faithfully in prison, and even though Paul wants to keep him around, he knows that this unresolved conflict with Philemon has to be reconciled if they say that they're followers of Jesus. Which moves Paul on to his bold request, that Philemon receive Onesimus back, no longer as a slave, but as more than a slave, as a beloved brother in the Lord. Now, this is a really tall order. Under Roman law, Philemon had every legal right to have Onesimus punished or put in prison, and Paul's not only asking him to forgive Onesimus, but to welcome back his former slave into Colossae as a social equal, as a family member. This is way more than kindness. This is unheard of. It's freeing a slave and then treating them like a family member. It upsets the status quo of the Roman social order. Why should Philemon do such a thing? And here Paul pulls a brilliant move. He recalls that key word from the opening prayer. He says, if you're truly a partner with me, it's that Greek word koinonia again, then welcome Onesimus as if he were me. And if he's wronged you or owes you anything, charge it to me and I will repay it. So in this request, we see the heart of Paul's gospel message being acted out. It's first of all about reconciliation. It's just like he told the Corinthians. In the Messiah, God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting people's sins against them. So in this situation, Paul is putting himself in the place of Jesus. He will absorb the consequences of Onesimus' wrongdoing. He will pay the cost so that he can be reconciled to Philemon. But Paul's message was about more than just a legal transaction. It's also about koinonia. Onesimus and Philemon and Paul are all equals before God. They all share the same need for forgiveness. And so the ground is level before the cross, which means that Philemon and Onesimus can no longer relate to each other as master and slave. They're family members. They're brothers in the Messiah. Or as Paul told Philemon and the whole church of Colossae, in God's new family, people are not Greek or Jewish or circumcised or uncircumcised or foreigners or uncivilized or slave or free, but the Messiah is all and is in all people. Paul closes the letter stating his confidence that Philemon will do even more than Paul's requested. And he asks him to prepare a guest room because he wants to visit as soon as he gets out of prison. And then with some final greetings, Paul ends the letter. Paul's letter to Philemon is powerful for many reasons. It's the only letter where Paul doesn't explicitly mention Jesus' death or resurrection, and this is not an oversight. He doesn't need to explain the cross with words because he's demonstrating it through his actions. Paul's embodying here the meaning of the cross. He has made himself the place through which Onesimus and Philemon are reconciled to God and then to each other. This letter also shows us that the implications of the good news about Jesus, they are extremely personal and never private. The fact that Philemon and Onesimus are now brothers in the Messiah, it makes their master-slave relationship totally irrelevant. The family of Jesus' people is the place where all are equal recipients of God's grace. It's a new kind of society, or a new humanity, as he called it in the letter to the Colossians, where people's value and social status is not defined by race or gender or social or economic class. In the Messiah, there are simply new humans who are equal partners, who share together in God's healing mercy through Jesus. And that's what Paul's letter to Philemon is all about.
Is that something we can find on different books, just like online, or do you have to subscribe?
You have to pay me about $10. I will find it for you.
Just go online.
Just go on
type in Bible
YouTube.
Project.
Okay.
And type in Bible Project. and you'll get all of them. They do pretty much all the books. They also have topics like the Messiah, the coming Messiah, Old Testament topics. And I would say this, and I said this last week, you still should be discerning as you watch them, because there's going to be a few things in there that might make your little Lutheran sensibilities kind of go off a little bit. But for the most part, as I've watched them, I use them all the time. It's really not horrible. I've seen worse. But they do a great job. And they don't always do the illustrations. They do a lot more cartoon animation stuff. So they're really good. But a good summary of the book of Philemon. Really just really well done. All right, so the gospel changes everything. Paul uses the relationship between Philemon and Onesimus as an example of how the gospel transforms the master-slave relationship. So this is all going on. Paul's under house arrest. The other guy is there, and then Philemon is there, and Paul's writing a letter to the Ephesians, Colossians, and the Philippians. He's writing these letters at the same time. He's trying to figure out, how do I deal with this situation between Onesimus and Philemon? And so you actually see him writing to the church of Ephesus about this relationship. He says here, slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly, as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward each one for whatever good they do, whether they are slave or free. And masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. So Paul, as he's, I want to say, somewhat enslaved and imprisoned, he's thinking about the practical nature of the gospel and how it affects even what could be more dynamic than a master and a slave relationship, complete control and power and all this going on. And it was part of the Roman world, part of the Roman culture. But he takes that and he sees it through the filter of the gospel. And he says, he's not encouraging getting rid of slavery in that sense, but what he's encouraging is slaves and masters need to see each other through the light of the gospel and how they go along. Now, I know you talked about this, but I don't want to get a lot off track on this. But this is a different concept of slavery than when you and I hear the word slavery, we think of what happened in our own nation and elsewhere with the African American slave trade. That's not what's going on in Rome. That's not the same type of slavery. The slavery in Rome is when Romans would conquer nations and people. A lot of times those people were indentured servants. Sometimes they would in fact out of necessity enslave themselves. They would put themselves under the care of a master to provide for them and care for them. So some of them were bound because of being conquered or whatever, or being sold in that way. But it wasn't a racial thing at all. It was just part of the Roman culture. But Paul's not writing this letter to, nowhere in this entire thing does he say slavery should be abolished. Okay, it's just part of their culture. But what he's trying to say is, how does the gospel apply to this environment, to this relationship? If you have a master who is Christian, believer in Christ, and you have a slave, one of his workers is a Christian, then they're on equal status here. Now, whatever goes on in the culture, you're in charge and you're down here, your boss, your worker, whatever, that might still apply. But when it comes to faith, we should treat each other in the eye as we would as Christ. So he says that here to the letter in Ephesians. He also says the same thing in Colossians. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you to curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for their wrongs, and there is no favoritism. So Paul kind of has that same. So not only is he sending this letter to Philemon about recognizing this important koinonia, this partnership that exists, not just between Paul and Philemon, but between Philemon and Onesimus. He's writing this letter, but he's also sending these other two letters with the same kind of concept. So this a good summary, I guess I would say, of this whole thing is the gospel transforms all relationships. We are one together, as he said, as they said at the end there. No male, no female, no slave, no free, no Greek, no Jew, no. We're all one in Christ. I should have looked this up a little bit. I remember several years ago I was reading an account about Robert E. Lee, as you know, General Lee, Confederate general. I believe it was during the Civil War or shortly thereafter. He was in church worshiping, and he went up to the altar to kneel to receive the Lord's Supper, and he was kneeling with a couple African American, a couple black people kneeling with him at the altar receiving the Lord's Supper. And somebody asked him about it, and his response was, when it comes to God's grace, there is no distinction. We are all one. I'm a general and they're not, but we're all one under God's grace. And I might have misquoted that somewhat, but that's kind of what Paul is trying to get across in this message, this short little letter to Philemon, is the gospel transforms our relationships. We should see each other in light of what Christ has done for us. Any questions about that? That's all I got. It's one of those little tiny letters stuck there in the New Testament. Very important, though. Yeah.
What are our little pieces of paper?
I'm not bad. I'm done with Philemon. Are you done with it? Are we good?
So,
Yeah.
so Paul's not, misunderstand, he's not asking him to totally give him his freedom. He's just asking him to treat him.
He's strongly suggesting it, but he's not. Yeah.
Asking him to treat him as a fellow Christian.
Right. Yeah. I think that's. I don't think, as I was reading through there was anything in there. There's kind of I think this behind the scenes kind of a little tug at him, like, this changes your relationship. Maybe you need to rethink whether you want him to be a slave under your. But he doesn't say it specifically.
But he wants to repay his debt.
Right. Yeah. So whatever Onesimus did, Paul says, I'll take care of it. Which is somewhat interesting because where's Paul?
Yeah.
Where does he get his money?
Yeah, right. He's got a lot of people supporting him,
So we're
He's
slave
got the
owners.
LWML and Philippi that's sending him money every now and then, But,
Were all slave owners during that time prominent? They had money?
yeah.
They all had money.
Yeah, and a slave, we say the word slave, but it's a broad definition. It could be just a servant. Even in Jesus' time, remember, the servants would come in and you'd wash your feet. I mean, it was just household servants. So the word slave doesn't. We have this strict connotation in our brain because of a history in our own nation about what slavery is, the horribleness of slavery. But that's not really what it was in the Roman Empire. The slave, a lot of masters were not cruel and harsh with their servants. It was a, I don't want to say kind of a boss manager worker relationship, but it was a lot of them were like that, and they were usually wealthy. It was just a common thing to have servants if you were wealthy. All right, so that's Philemon. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. All right, God's peace.